Welcome, friend, to this gentle journey through time, where we'll explore one of history's most haunting yet captivating winters. Tonight, we're stepping into the snow-covered streets of 1920s Paris, during what historians now call the heroin craze, a period when the City of Light became shadowed by something far more sinister than most people realize. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to experience winter during one of the most dangerous yet culturally explosive periods in Parisian history? Well, the answer isn't what you might expect from romantic stories about bohemian artists and jazz-age glamour. Instead, what I'm about to reveal will show you how the brutal winters of the 1920s became the perfect backdrop for a crisis that would consume an entire generation of creative souls. In this journey through frozen Paris, I'm going to walk you through exactly what those winters felt like for the people caught in the grip of this epidemic. By the end of this series, you'll understand how cold, desperation, and addiction created a perfect storm that transformed the most beautiful city in the world into something resembling a waking nightmare. But before we dive into those snow-covered streets where dreams went to die, let me paint you the bigger picture of why winter became so crucial to this tragic story. The year was 1922, and Paris was experiencing something unprecedented. The Great War had ended just 4 years earlier, leaving behind a generation of young people who had witnessed horrors that previous generations could never imagine. These weren't just statistics in history books. These were real human beings, many barely out of their teens, who had seen their friends die in trenches and returned home to a world that no longer made sense to them. Winter in Paris during the 1920s wasn't just cold. It was bone-penetrating, soul-crushing cold that seemed to seep into every corner of the city. The heating systems in most buildings were inadequate. Coal was expensive, and many of the young artists, writers, and intellectuals who flocked to the city lived in tiny attic rooms that offered little protection against the brutal temperatures. But here's what makes this story different from typical tales of urban hardship. The cold wasn't just a physical challenge. It became a psychological weapon that drove vulnerable people toward choices they never would have considered under normal circumstances. Picture this scene from December 1923. A 19-year-old aspiring painter from Lyon sits shivering in her cramped studio apartment in Marat. The thin walls offer no barrier against the wind that howls through the narrow streets below. Her fingers are too numb to hold a paintbrush steady, and she hasn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days because she spent her last francs on canvas and paint. This is the reality that thousands of young people faced every winter in Paris during this era. But Marie Cialet's story takes a darker turn that represents what happened to so many others during these frozen months. A charming, older artist named Rhea approaches her at a cafe. Noticing her obvious struggle, he offers her warmth, food, and most importantly, something he claims will help her forget about the cold and the hunger. Something that will make her feel like she's floating above all her problems. That something was heroin. And Mary Cialet's first taste came on a night when the temperature dropped to -15 C. The connection between winter and addiction wasn't coincidental. Cold weather created desperation that made people vulnerable to substances that promised temporary relief from their suffering. When you're freezing, hungry, and alone in a foreign city, The offer of something that can make all that pain disappear becomes incredibly appealing. The dealers and suppliers who operated throughout Paris understood this psychology perfectly, and they timed their recruitment efforts to coincide with the harshest months of the year. Winter also created practical conditions that facilitated the spread of heroin use throughout artistic communities. The cold drove people indoors, leading to crowded gatherings in small, poorly ventilated spaces where diseases and habits spread rapidly. Artists, studios, writer garrets, and bohemian cafes became pressure cookers of shared misery and mutual dependence. When one person in these tight-knit communities discovered a substance that seemed to offer relief from the brutal conditions, word spread quickly through networks of desperate, creative individuals. Let me tell you about the winter of 1924, which locals later remembered as the most devastating season in the city's modern history. The temperature remained below freezing for 6 consecutive weeks, and snow accumulated to depths that paralyzed normal city functions. The Seine partially froze, which was almost unheard of in Paris. But the real tragedy wasn't the weather itself. It was how the extreme conditions accelerated the heroin crisis that was already beginning to take hold in artistic communities. During that brutal winter, a young American writer named Thomas Whitmore documented his experiences in letters to his family back in Ohio. His correspondence, discovered decades later in a trunk in his family's attic, provides a chilling first-hand account of how winter transformed ordinary people into desperate addicts. Thomas wrote about walking through the Latin Quarter on January mornings when the snow crunched under his feet and seeing bodies of young people who had frozen to death in doorways, their faces still bearing the peaceful expressions that heroin had given them in their final moments. The cafes that would later become infamous as centers of the heroin trade started as legitimate gathering places where artists and intellectuals sought refuge from the cold. Café de Flor Lumago and dozens of smaller establishments throughout Marnes and Saint-Jean-de-Prés became unofficial heating centers for young people who couldn't afford to keep their own lodgings warm. But as winter dragged on and desperation increased, these same cafes began attracting a different type of clientele. Dealers understood that cold, desperate people made ideal customers. They would position themselves in these warm gathering places, offering substances that promised not just physical warmth, but emotional escape from the harsh realities of winter survival in an expensive city. A single dose of heroin could make someone forget about empty stomachs, frozen fingers, and the crushing loneliness that came with being far from home during the darkest months of the year. The winter of 1925 saw the establishment of what locals called warming houses, which appeared to be charitable organizations offering hot meals and shelter to struggling artists and writers. In reality, many of these facilities were sophisticated recruitment centers, operated by criminal organizations that had recognized the profit potential in exploiting winter desperation. Young people would arrive seeking basic necessities like food and warmth, and leave with addictions that would define the rest of their lives. Consider the case of Alina Kozlov, a Russian immigrant who had fled her homeland after the revolution and arrived in Paris with nothing but her talent as a violinist and a fierce determination to build a new life. During the winter of 1925, she found herself playing for coins on street corners, her fingers so cold that she could barely hold her bow. A well-dressed woman approached her one evening, claiming to represent a charitable organization that helped refugee musicians. The woman offered Alina warm shelter, regular meals, and the opportunity to perform for appreciative audiences in private salons. What Alina didn't realize was that these private salons were actually sophisticated drug distribution networks that used cultural activities as cover for their illegal operations. The warm, luxurious environments provided stark contrast to the frozen streets outside, making the offer irresistible to someone who had been sleeping in doorways and eating scraps. Once inside these networks, Alina discovered that the warmth and comfort came with expectations. Participation in certain activities was required, and those activities gradually introduced her to substances that made the cold seem irrelevant. The psychological impact of winter during this period cannot be overstated. Seasonal depression, which we now understand as a legitimate medical condition, was not recognized by physicians in the 1920s. Young people suffering from what we would now diagnose as severe seasonal affective disorder were told they simply needed to work harder or develop stronger character. This lack of understanding about mental health created additional vulnerability that criminal organizations learned to exploit. Winter also affected the supply chains that brought heroin into Paris, creating artificial scarcity that drove up prices and increased the desperation of people who had already become dependent. Ships carrying contraband had difficulty navigating frozen rivers and canals. Border crossings became more heavily monitored as customs officials sought warm indoor assignments. These logistical challenges meant that supplies became unreliable just when demand was highest, creating a perfect storm of market conditions that maximized both profits and human suffering. The clothing worn by heroin users during these winters tells its own tragic story. Many had sold their warm coats, hats, and boots to fund their addictions, leaving them even more vulnerable to the cold. Others wore layers of newspapers under thin garments, trying to create insulation that would allow them to survive outdoor conditions, while spending their money on drugs rather than proper clothing. Police reports from the period described finding bodies of young people who had frozen to death while wearing expensive jewelry or carrying valuable art supplies, having chosen to maintain their addictions rather than trade these items for warm clothing. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of winter during the heroin craze was how it separated people from support systems that might have helped them recover. Travel was difficult and expensive during winter months, making it nearly impossible for concerned family members to reach Paris and intervene in their loved ones' downward spirals. Letters took weeks to arrive, and by the time families back home realized the severity of the situation, it was often too late to prevent tragedy. The winter of 1926 marked a turning point in the crisis, though few people recognized it at the time. The combination of particularly harsh weather conditions and increased availability of heroin from new supply routes created what addiction specialists would later identify as a perfect storm for epidemic spread. Young people who had previously experimented only occasionally found themselves unable to function without daily doses, while newcomers to the city arrived just as the most dangerous season was beginning. The winter months also revealed the sophisticated organizational structures that had developed around the heroin trade during this period. What appeared to casual observers as random gatherings of bohemian artists were actually carefully orchestrated networks designed to maximize both recruitment and profit during the most vulnerable season of the year. Criminal organizations had learned that winter desperation created ideal conditions for expanding their customer base, and they developed seasonal strategies that would make modern marketing executives envious of their precision and effectiveness. Underground networks established what they called circuit routes through the city's artistic quarters, timed to coincide with the coldest nights when young people were most likely to be seeking indoor shelter. These routes connected various cafes, studios, and supposed charitable organizations in patterns that ensured maximum exposure to potential new users while maintaining plausible deniability about their true purposes. A struggling poet might start the evening at a legitimate literary discussion in Sanja, move to a supposedly charitable soup kitchen in the Latin Quarter, and end up at a private studio gathering in more. Each stop gradually introducing them to more dangerous substances and more compromising situations. The winter of 1927 brought innovations in distribution, methods that demonstrated how criminal organizations adapted their tactics to seasonal conditions. Dealers began using what they called typically young women who could move through the city without attracting police attention to deliver supplies directly to customers who were too sick or too cold to venture outside. These runners often posed as concerned friends or charitable volunteers carrying what appeared to be care packages containing food, warm clothing, and medical supplies. Hidden within these seemingly innocent deliveries were the drugs that kept customers dependent while generating enormous profits for the organizations that controlled the trade. Temperature records from this period show that the winter of 1927 was one of the coldest on record, with some nights reaching temperatures that had not been experienced in Paris for over a century. The extreme conditions created desperation that extended far beyond the usual population of struggling artists and writers. Middle-class students, young professionals, and even some members of established families found themselves unable to afford adequate heating and began seeking the temporary warmth and euphoria that heroin promised. This expansion of the user base created new challenges for the criminal organizations, but also new opportunities. They developed tiered systems that offered different qualities of product at different price points, ensuring that people from various economic backgrounds could find something within their budget. The cheapest options were often dangerously impure, cut with substances that created additional health risks, while premium products were reserved for customers who could pay higher prices or who provided other valuable services to the organizations. Medical records from Parisian hospitals during these winters reveal patterns that modern addiction specialists recognize as classic indicators of epidemic spread. Emergency admissions for what were euphemistically called winter illnesses increased dramatically during the coldest months, with symptoms that doctors struggled to understand because they had no framework for recognizing systematic drug poisoning. Many physicians attributed these mysterious ailments to malnutrition, exposure, or exotic diseases brought to the city by foreign refugees. The lack of medical understanding about addiction meant that even well-intentioned efforts to help often made situations worse. Doctors prescribed additional medications to treat withdrawal symptoms they didn't recognize, sometimes creating multiple dependencies in patients who had originally sought help for single substance problems. Charitable organizations distributed blankets and food to people suffering from what they believed was simple poverty, not realizing that their targets were actually experiencing medical emergencies that required specialized treatment. Winter also created unique challenges for law enforcement. Agencies that were already struggling to understand and address the growing heroin crisis. Police officers found it difficult to distinguish between legitimate artistic gatherings and criminal activities, when both took place in the same warm indoor spaces that provided refuge from brutal outdoor conditions. The seasonal nature of the problem meant that evidence often disappeared when warmer weather arrived and people resumed outdoor activities, making it difficult to build cases against criminal organizations that had learned to exploit seasonal patterns. The winter of 1928 saw the introduction of what criminal organizations called warmth parties, sophisticated events that appeared to be charitable gatherings designed to help struggling artists survive the cold season. These parties were held in luxurious private homes and featured elaborate spreads of hot food, warm drinks, and comfortable accommodations that provided stark contrast to the frozen misery that most attendees were experiencing in their daily lives. The hosts presented themselves as wealthy patrons of the arts who wanted to support creative individuals during difficult times. In reality, these warmth parties were recruitment events designed to identify potential customers and begin the gradual process of creating dependencies. The hosts carefully observed their guests, noting who seemed most desperate, most isolated, and most vulnerable to manipulation. They provided not just physical warmth and sustenance, but emotional warmth through attention, compliments, and promises of ongoing support that filled psychological needs that winter had made acute. The parties typically followed a careful progression over multiple events. Initial gatherings focused on creating comfort and building trust through generous hospitality and genuine interest in guests' artistic work. Subsequent events gradually introduced alcohol and milder substances, always presented as sophisticated enhancements to cultural appreciation rather than dangerous drugs. Only after weeks or months of careful cultivation were the most vulnerable guests introduced to heroin, and by that point, they had developed such strong emotional attachments to their hosts and the warm community these events provided that resistance became psychologically difficult. Personal accounts from survivors of these warmth parties describe the psychological techniques used with chilling precision. Hosts would learn intimate details about their guests' backgrounds, family situations, artistic struggles, and personal insecurities during casual conversations that felt like friendly interest. This information was then used to create carefully tailored approaches that made each individual feel uniquely understood and valued. A young painter struggling with self-doubt would receive specific encouragement about their artistic vision. A writer dealing with family rejection would find acceptance and understanding. A musician facing financial crisis would receive offers of patronage and support. The winter conditions also enabled criminal organizations to create artificial scarcity around basic necessities that made their offers more attractive by controlling access to warm gathering spaces, hot food, and even information about legitimate sources of help. they could position themselves as essential resources for survival. Young people who might have sought help from family, friends, or legitimate charitable organizations found those options increasingly difficult to access during winter months when travel was dangerous and communication was limited. The criminal networks also exploited the way winter affected human psychology and decision-making. Research that wouldn't be conducted 4 decades later would confirm what these organizations understood intuitively. Cold temperatures and reduced sunlight affect brain chemistry in ways that make people more vulnerable to depression, poor judgment, and risky behavior. They timed their most aggressive recruitment efforts to coincide with the darkest, coldest weeks of winter, when their targets were most psychologically vulnerable. By 1928, the winter heroin crisis had become so severe that it began attracting attention from international observers who were documenting the broader cultural changes taking place in post-war Europe. Foreign journalists and social workers who visited Paris during winter months reported being shocked by the transformation they witnessed compared to the city's reputation for artistic vitality and cultural sophistication. The contrast between Paris's international image and the reality of winter conditions for young people caught in the heroin crisis became a source of diplomatic embarrassment for French authorities. These international observers also documented how the crisis was beginning to spread beyond Paris to other major European cities as criminal organizations expanded their operations, and as young people who had become addicted in Paris carried their dependencies with them when they traveled. The winter months became particularly dangerous periods for this geographic spread because seasonal depression and harsh weather conditions created similar vulnerabilities in other urban centers. The winter of 1928 would prove to be the last season when the heroin crisis could operate with relative impunity. Though none of the participants recognized this at the time, changes were already beginning that would eventually lead to the comprehensive crackdown that would destroy the networks that had thrived during these brutal winter months. But for the thousands of young people who were experiencing their first or final winter in the grip of addiction, these broader historical forces remained invisible against the immediate reality of trying to survive another frozen night in a city that had promised them artistic fulfillment, but delivered something far more dangerous. The transformation that winter brought to individual lives during this period reveals patterns that would haunt families for generations. Take the case of Philippe, a promising young sculptor from Bordeaux who arrived in Paris during the autumn of 1928 with letters of introduction to established artists and enough money to sustain himself through the winter months. Philip's story represents thousands of similar trajectories that played out across the frozen streets of the city during these years. Philippe had secured a small studio space in Belleville, far from the fashionable artistic quarters, but affordable enough to allow him to focus on his work rather than constantly worrying about rent. His plan was simple: spend the winter months creating a portfolio of pieces that would establish his reputation when spring arrived, and the gallery season resumed in earnest. He had calculated his expenses carefully, budgeting for materials, food, and heating costs based on information provided by other artists who had made similar transitions. But Philip's careful calculations failed to account for the psychological impact of prolonged isolation in a tiny, barely heated space during one of the most severe winters in recent memory. By December, he was spending 18 hours a day alone in his studio, unable to afford the coal necessary to heat the space adequately and unwilling to waste money on cafe visits that would eat into his materials budget. The sculpture he was working on required precise hand movements that became increasingly difficult as temperatures dropped and his fingers grew numb. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal cold snap in January, when Philip realized he hadn't spoken to another human being in 4 days. The isolation had become so complete that he was beginning to lose track of time, sometimes working through the night simply because he had no way to distinguish between day and darkness in his windowless studio. When a fellow artist named Claude knocked on his door, offering friendship and warmth, Philip's gratitude made him vulnerable to influences he would never have considered under normal circumstances. Claude represented a new type of predator that had emerged during the winter months of the heroin crisis. Unlike the obvious dealers who operated in cafes and public spaces, Claude appeared to be exactly what Philippe needed. A successful artist who understood the struggles of creative work and offered genuine companionship during the most isolated period of the year. Claude's studio was warm, well lit, and filled with interesting people who seemed to appreciate Philip's work and welcomed him into their community. What Philippe didn't realize was that Claude's warm, welcoming studio served as a sophisticated recruitment center, designed specifically to target isolated artists during the winter months. The community that had embraced him so readily was actually a carefully constructed network of users, dealers, and facilitators who worked together to identify and cultivate new customers. The warmth, friendship, and artistic validation he received came with subtle but persistent pressure to participate in activities that gradually introduced him to increasingly dangerous substances. The progression from isolation to addiction followed patterns the criminal organizations had refined through years of experimentation during winter months. Philip's first experiences with drugs came disguised as artistic exploration, presented as techniques that successful artists use to enhance their creative vision and break through conventional limitations. The substances were introduced gradually, always in social settings that reinforced the idea that drug use was a normal part of sophisticated artistic culture. The physical effects of heroin proved particularly appealing to someone who had been struggling with cold, hunger, and isolation for months. The drug didn't just provide euphoria. It created sensations of warmth that made winter conditions seem irrelevant and eliminated the knowing anxiety that had been building as Philip's money dwindled and his artistic progress stalled. For someone whose daily existence had become a constant struggle against physical discomfort and psychological despair, heroin offered complete relief from problems that had seemed insurmountable. But the most insidious aspect of Philip's recruitment was how it exploited his artistic identity and professional ambitions. The people who introduced him to heroin weren't random criminals seeking profit. They were individuals who understood artistic culture and could speak credibly about creative processes, aesthetic theories, and professional opportunities. They convinced Philippe that drug use would enhance rather than hinder his artistic development, pointing to examples of successful artists who had supposedly achieved greatness through chemical enhancement of their creative abilities. The winter environment made verification of these claims nearly impossible. Gallery visits were limited by weather conditions. Professional networking events were suspended until spring, and communication with established artists was difficult when heating costs made social gatherings expensive. FIP had no reliable way to distinguish between legitimate artistic advice and manipulation designed to serve criminal interests. The isolation that winter imposed made him dependent on information provided by the only people who offered him warmth and companionship during the most difficult months of the year. By February, Felipe's artistic production had virtually ceased as his daily routine became organized around obtaining and using heroin rather than creating sculpture. The studio space he had rented with such optimism became just another location for drug use, its original purpose forgotten as basic survival. Needs took precedence over creative ambitions. The money he had carefully budgeted for materials and living expenses was redirected toward maintaining his addiction, creating a downward spiral that accelerated as winter conditions made legitimate income opportunities increasingly scarce. The criminal organizations that operated during these winter months had developed sophisticated methods for extracting maximum value from customers like FIPE, whose resources were limited, but whose desperation was complete. They offered credit arrangements that allowed addicts to maintain their habits even after their money ran out, creating debt relationships that could be exploited for various purposes. Philippe found himself performing services for his suppliers that gradually transformed him from customer to participant in the criminal enterprise that had originally targeted him. These services initially seemed harmless, delivering packages between different locations, introducing new people to the warm community that had welcomed him, or simply providing information about other struggling artists who might benefit from the friendship and support he had received. Philippe didn't recognize that he was becoming a recruiter for the same system that had exploited his vulnerabilities, identifying other isolated artists who might be susceptible to the same techniques that had been used against him. The psychological mechanisms that enabled this transformation revealed the sophisticated understanding of human nature that criminal organizations had developed through years of operating during winter months. They recognized that people who had been helped during desperate circumstances developed powerful feelings of gratitude and loyalty toward their benefactors, even when rational analysis might suggest that the help came with unacceptable costs. Philippe genuinely believed that he owed his survival to people who had provided warmth and companionship when he needed the most, making it difficult for him to recognize or resist their requests for assistance. The winter of 1928 also saw the emergence of what investigators later called family networks, criminal organizations that deliberately created artificial kinship relationships with their targets. These networks recognized that winter isolation made to young people particularly hungry for emotional connections that replaced the family relationships they had left behind. Dealers and recruiters presented themselves as surrogate brothers, sisters, parents, or mentors, offering not just drugs, but also emotional support and guidance that filled psychological needs created by separation from home communities. These family networks were particularly effective with young women who had traveled to Paris seeking artistic opportunities, but found themselves vulnerable to exploitation during winter months when legitimate opportunities were scarce. Criminal organizations created sophisticated support systems that addressed practical needs like housing, food, and protection, while gradually introducing expectations and obligations that transformed recipients into participants in illegal activities. The emotional bonds created through these relationships were often stronger than the chemical dependencies that developed alongside them. Marie Dubois, a 19-year-old aspiring dancer from Marseille, became involved with one of these family networks during the winter of 1928 after responding to an advertisement for affordable housing in an artist's boarding house. The boarding house appeared to be exactly what she needed: warm, safe accommodation at a price she could afford, surrounded by other young artists who shared her interests and ambitions. The older woman who managed the facility, Madame Laurent, presented herself as a maternal figure who understood the challenges facing young artists and wanted to help them succeed. What Marie didn't realize was that the boarding house served as a sophisticated recruitment and control center for a criminal organization that specialized in exploiting young women during winter months when they were most vulnerable to manipulation. Madame Laurent had developed precise techniques for identifying residents who were struggling financially or emotionally, offering them increasingly personal support that created feelings of dependence and obligation. The transformation from tenant to victim occurred so gradually that most residents never recognized when they had crossed the line from receiving help to being controlled. The family network that operated through Marie's boarding house used winter conditions to create artificial crises that made residents more dependent on the support system provided by the organization. Heating problems that required residents to share rooms, food shortages that necessitated group meals and transportation, difficulties that limited outside contact, were all carefully orchestrated to strengthen internal relationships, while weakening connections to external support systems. By spring, many residents had become so integrated into the artificial family structure that leaving seemed psychologically impossible, even when they recognized the dangerous nature of their situation. The winter months also revealed how criminal organizations had learned to exploit seasonal employment patterns that affected young people seeking artistic careers in Paris. Traditional sources of income, like modeling for artists, performing in cafes, or providing tutoring services, became scarce during winter months, when wealthy patrons left the city and cultural activities were suspended. This created predictable periods of financial desperation that criminal organizations could exploit by offering alternative income opportunities that gradually led to deeper involvement in illegal activities. Street musicians like Lenina Kossoff found themselves facing impossible choices as winter weather made outdoor performances impractical, while indoor venues demanded connections, an influence that newcomers to the city rarely possessed. Warming houses that appeared to offer charitable assistance to struggling performers were actually recruitment centers designed to identify individuals whose skills and desperation made them valuable assets for criminal organizations. Elena's violin playing, which had been her source of legitimate income, became a tool for attracting customers to illegal establishments where her musical performances provided cover for drug transactions. The sophistication of these operations during winter months revealed organizational capabilities that law enforcement agencies were completely unprepared to address. Criminal networks had developed seasonal strategies that took advantage of weather patterns, social customs, and economic cycles in ways that maximized both profits and recruitment while minimizing risks of detection. They understood that winter created natural cover for their activities, as reduced police patrols, limited visibility, and focus on weather-related problems diverted attention from the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. Intelligence gathered by criminal organizations during winter months provided them with detailed information about potential customers, law enforcement capabilities, and competitive threats that informed their operations throughout the year. They used the forced intimacy created by winter conditions to gather personal information about targets that could be used for blackmail, recruitment, or market expansion. The social networks that formed around shared survival needs during winter months became intelligence assets that criminal organizations exploited long after the weather had improved. The winter of 1928 marked the peak of these sophisticated criminal operations. Though participants had no way of recognizing that they were living through the final season, when such activities could operate with relative impunity. Changes in law enforcement approaches, international cooperation, and public awareness were already beginning that would eventually lead to the comprehensive crackdown that would destroy the networks that had thrived during these winter months. But for the thousands of young people experiencing their final winter in the grip of addiction, these broader historical forces remained invisible against the immediate reality of trying to survive another frozen night in a city that had promised them artistic fulfillment, but delivered systematic exploitation instead. The physical evidence of winter's impact during this period tells a story that official records often overlooked or deliberately obscured. Building superintendents throughout the artistic quarters of Paris began noticing patterns that would later prove crucial to understanding the scope of the crisis. Apartments that had been rented to promising young artists in autumn were frequently abandoned by spring, their contents left behind as if the occupants had simply vanished into the winter night. These abandoned spaces revealed the desperate measures people had taken to survive the cold months. Furniture had been broken apart and burned for warmth, leaving behind charred remnants and smoke stains that told stories of final attempts to maintain basic comfort. Personal belongings were often arranged in strange configurations that suggested their owners had been operating under the influence of substances that altered their perception of reality. Paintings were left half-finished, their surfaces cracked from freezing temperatures that had been allowed to penetrate. Living spaces when fuel money had been redirected toward other needs. The landlords who discovered these scenes initially attributed them to typical bohemian eccentricity or simple poverty, but patterns began emerging that suggested something more systematic was occurring. Multiple apartments in the same building showed similar signs of abandonment, always during the coldest months, always with valuable items left behind that could have been sold to pay rent or buy food. The randomness that might have characterized individual tragedies gave way to consistency that implied organized exploitation of vulnerable tenants. Property records from this period reveal another dimension of how criminal organizations adapted their operations to winter conditions. They began acquiring buildings in areas where struggling artists typically sought affordable housing. then manipulating heating systems and maintenance schedules to create artificial crises that made tenants more dependent on alternative sources of warmth and comfort. A building's heating system might mysteriously fail during the coldest week of winter, forcing residents to seek shelter in establishments that happened to offer both warmth and substances that made the cold seem irrelevant. These property manipulations were coordinated with recruitment efforts in ways that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology under stress. When residents were driven from their apartments by heating failures, helpful individuals would appear, offering temporary shelter in warm, comfortable spaces where drug use was gradually introduced as part of the hospitality. By the time heating was restored to their original apartments, many residents had developed dependencies that made returning to isolated, cold living spaces psychologically difficult. The winter of 1929 brought innovations in criminal methodology that would later be recognized as precursors to modern organized crime techniques. Criminal networks began using what they called temperature surveillance, systematic monitoring of weather conditions and heating system failures throughout the city to identify optimal times and locations for recruitment activities. They developed detailed maps of neighborhoods that correlated building heating capabilities with resident demographics, allowing them to predict where and when people would be most vulnerable to their approaches. This surveillance extended to monitoring the financial resources of potential targets through networks of informants in banks, post offices, and money transfer services. They could identify when someone's family funds were running low or when expected financial support had failed to arrive, timing their offers of assistance to coincide with moments of maximum desperation. The combination of physical discomfort from cold and financial anxiety created psychological conditions that made even cautious individuals susceptible to offers they would have rejected under normal circumstances. Medical professionals during this period began documenting symptoms they couldn't fully explain, but which formed patterns that suggested systematic poisoning of significant portions of the young adult population. Dr. Henry Beaumont, who operated a small clinic near the Saône, kept detailed records of patients who sought treatment for what appeared to be severe influenza, but who displayed unusual combinations of symptoms that didn't match any known diseases. These patients typically arrive during the coldest months, often in groups, exhibiting signs of malnutrition, despite having access to adequate food resources. Dr. Beaumont's notes, discovered decades later in hospital archives, described patients whose pupils remained dilated, regardless of lighting conditions, whose breathing patterns were unnaturally slow and shallow, and who displayed emotional detachment that seemed inconsistent with their stated concerns about their health. Most puzzling to medical professionals was the patient's apparent indifference to cold temperatures that should have been causing significant discomfort. They would arrive at the clinic wearing inadequate clothing for winter conditions, but claiming to feel perfectly warm and comfortable. The medical mystery deepened when Dr. Beaumont attempted to follow up with patients who had received treatment for these mysterious winter illnesses. Many had provided addresses that turned out to be non-existent or had moved from their stated locations without leaving forwarding information. Others could be located but displayed no memory of their previous medical visits or claimed that someone else had brought them to the clinic against their will. The pattern suggested either elaborate deception or systematic impairment of memory and judgment that prevented patients from maintaining consistent contact with medical care. Hospital emergency departments throughout Paris began reporting similar patterns during winter months, though the medical establishment of the time lacked frameworks for understanding what they were observing. Emergency physicians noted increased admissions for what they termed winter madness, cases where previously rational young people would arrive in states of extreme agitation or complete stupor, often accompanied by friends or acquaintances who provided vague or contradictory explanations for their condition. These emergency cases frequently involved young people who had been found unconscious in public places during extremely cold weather, but who showed no signs of frostbite or hypothermia despite being inadequately dressed for the conditions. Their body temperatures were often dangerously low, but their circulation patterns suggested that they had been exposed to substances that altered their normal physiological responses to cold. Medical personnel were puzzled by patients who remained conscious and communicative, despite displaying vital signs that should have indicated life-threatening medical emergencies. The winter months also created unique challenges for families trying to maintain contact with young relatives who had moved to Paris seeking artistic opportunities. Postal services became unreliable during severe weather. Telegraph systems experienced frequent outages, and telephone connections were limited and expensive. This communication breakdown meant that concerning changes in behavior or circumstances often went undetected until spring brought improved contact opportunities and family visits that revealed the extent of deterioration that had occurred during the winter months. Letters that did manage to reach families during winter months often displayed subtle but disturbing changes in handwriting, vocabulary, and emotional tone that suggested their authors were experiencing significant psychological changes. Parents and siblings who had maintained regular correspondence with loved ones in Paris began receiving communications that seemed to come from different people, displaying personality alterations that couldn't be explained by normal artistic development or urban sophistication. The content of these letters frequently followed patterns that would later be recognized as indicators of systematic manipulation. Writers would express sudden disinterest in family relationships, while displaying intense attachment to new friends whose identities remained vague. They would describe financial difficulties while simultaneously mentioning expensive purchases or activities that seemed inconsistent with their stated poverty. Most concerning to families was the emergence of secretive language and references to activities that the writers seemed reluctant to explain clearly. Criminal organizations had developed sophisticated techniques for controlling communication between their targets and potential sources of outside support or intervention. They monitored mail delivery to buildings where they operated, intercepting letters that might contain money, warnings, or requests for information that could interfere with their activities. They also coached their targets on what to write in outgoing correspondence, providing templates and suggestions that maintained appearances of normal communication while avoiding topics that might trigger family concern or intervention. The psychological techniques used to control communication revealed deep understanding of family dynamics and emotional manipulation. Criminal operators would analyze intercepted family letters to identify relationship tensions, financial pressures, and emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited to discourage outside intervention. They would help their targets craft responses that played on family guilt, financial concerns, or cultural expectations in ways that made relatives less likely to visit Paris or demand detailed information about their loved ones' circumstances. Winter weather provided natural cover for these communications. Control efforts because families expected that contact would be more difficult during harsh weather months. Delayed or missing letters could be attributed to postal disruptions rather than deliberate interference. Vague or concerning communications could be explained as results of seasonal depression or temporary financial stress rather than indicators of serious problems requiring immediate intervention. The criminal networks also exploited winter holiday traditions to strengthen their control over targets, while weakening family relationships. They organized elaborate holiday celebrations that provided warmth, food, and companionship during times when targets would normally be thinking about home and family connections. These artificial celebrations created emotional experiences that competed with family memories while reinforcing the idea that the criminal network provided better support and understanding than biological relatives. These holiday gatherings were carefully orchestrated to maximize emotional impact while introducing new levels of drug use and criminal activity. Participants were encouraged to view the network as their chosen family, superior to biological relatives who supposedly didn't understand their artistic ambitions or sophisticated urban lifestyle. The timing of these events during traditional family holidays created psychological conflicts that made targets feel guilty about missing family celebrations while simultaneously providing them with seemingly superior alternatives. The winter of 1929 saw the introduction of what criminal organizations called reunion resistance, systematic techniques for discouraging targets from returning home during traditional family gathering periods. They created artificial crises that required targets to remain in Paris, offered special opportunities that couldn't be postponed, or simply made travel arrangements impossible through various forms of sabotage or misdirection. When targets did attempt to return home during winter months, criminal organizations often arranged for them to be accompanied by handlers who posed as friends or romantic partners, but who were actually assigned to monitor their activities and ensure their return to Paris. These handlers were trained to identify signs of family intervention or attempts to separate targets from their addictions, providing early warning that allowed criminal networks to develop counter-strategies or simply write off targets who were becoming too difficult to control. The handlers also served as intelligence gatherers who collected information about targets' family resources, relationships, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future manipulation efforts. They would return to Paris with detailed assessments of family wealth, internal dynamics, and potential pressure points that criminal organizations could use to discourage future intervention attempts, or even to expand their operations to target additional family members. The sophistication of these winter operations reached levels that would not be seen again in criminal history until the development of modern organized crime syndicates decades later. The networks operating in Paris during the late 1920s had created integrated systems that combined real estate manipulation, medical exploitation, communication control, and psychological warfare in ways that maximize their ability to recruit and profit from vulnerable populations during the most dangerous months of the year. Intelligence documents recovered much later would reveal that these criminal organizations had developed detailed operational manuals that could be used to replicate their techniques in other cities and during other seasons. The winter crisis in Paris was not just a local tragedy, but a testing ground for criminal methodologies that would eventually spread throughout Europe and beyond, carried by operatives who had learned their techniques during the brutal winter months when desperate young people proved that human nature could be systematically exploited by those who understood its weaknesses. As the winter of 1929 drew toward its close, few participants in the ongoing crisis recognized that they were living through the final season when such sophisticated criminal exploitation could operate with relative impunity. The networks that had perfected their techniques during years of brutal winter months had created their own destruction through the very success of their operations, attracting attention and generating evidence that would eventually lead to their systematic dismantling. But for the thousands of young people who had experienced their transformation from hopeful artists to desperate addicts during these winter months, the approaching spring offered no promise of redemption or return to their former lives. The changes that winter had wrought in their bodies and souls would prove more permanent than the seasonal cycles that had enabled their exploitation, creating tragedies that would echo through families and communities for generations after the criminal networks that had created them had been destroyed. Networks that had created them had been destroyed. The spring of 1929 arrived in Paris with a cruelty that those who had survived the winter months could barely comprehend. As temperatures began to rise and the first tentative buds appeared on the plane trees lining the boulevards, the true extent of what had transpired during those frozen months became impossible to ignore. The warming weather that should have brought relief and renewal instead revealed the landscape of human devastation that shocked even the most cynical observers of Parisian society. Police reports from April and May of 1929 document a phenomenon that investigators struggled to categorize or explain. As the snow melted and spring cleaning commenced throughout the city's artistic quarters, building superintendents began discovering what they initially assumed were isolated tragedies, but which soon revealed themselves to be part of a systematic catastrophe. In building after building, apartment after apartment, the evidence accumulated of lives that had been systematically destroyed during the preceding winter months. The physical evidence told stories that survivors were either unable or unwilling to articulate. Apartments that had been rented to promising young artists contained collections of personal belongings that suggested their owners had undergone complete personality transformations during the cold months. Paintings were left half finished, their surfaces bearing evidence of techniques and subject matter that bore no resemblance to the artist's previous work. Sculptures had been abandoned mid-creation, their forms twisted into shapes that suggested the influence of altered consciousness rather than artistic vision. More disturbing were the personal items that revealed the progression of addiction and exploitation. Expensive clothing and jewelry were found alongside crude, improvised drug paraphernalia, suggesting that valuable possessions had been gradually sold or traded to maintain access to substances. Letters from concerned family members lay unopened in piles, while carefully crafted responses sat unsent. Their contents revealing the sophisticated coaching that had been used to maintain false impressions of normalcy while preventing outside intervention. The medical community began to recognize patterns that had been invisible during the crisis itself, but which became undeniable as spring brought survivors seeking help for conditions that physicians had never encountered before. Dr. Elizabeth Morrow, one of the few female physicians practicing in Paris during this period, documented cases that would later be recognized as classic presentations of systematic poisoning and psychological manipulation. Dr. Morrow's patients typically arrived at her clinic displaying what she termed winter syndrome, a combination of physical and psychological symptoms that seemed to result from prolonged exposure to unknown substances, combined with extreme psychological stress. These patients showed signs of severe malnutrition despite having access to adequate food resources, suggesting that their consumption patterns had been altered by chemicals that suppressed normal appetite and digestion functions. The psychological presentations were even more disturbing than the physical symptoms. Patients displayed profound dissociation from their previous identities, often unable to remember basic biographical information about themselves or their families. They spoke about their recent experiences as if describing events that had happened to other people, using language and terminology that seemed foreign to their educational backgrounds and social origins. Most concerning to Dr. Morrow was their apparent inability to form emotional attachments to people outside the networks that had controlled them during the winter months. Recovery proved to be an agonizingly slow process that revealed the sophisticated nature of the psychological manipulation that had been employed against these individuals. Patients who had been successful artists, writers, or musicians before their winter experiences showed no interest in returning to their previous pursuits, claiming that such activities now seemed meaningless or impossible to them. They had been systematically separated not just from their substances of addiction, but from their entire sense of personal identity and creative purpose. The spring of 1929 also brought international attention to what had previously been viewed as a local Parisian problem. Foreign correspondents who arrived to document the post-winter recovery efforts were shocked by the scale of human devastation they encountered. American journalist Margaret Sinclair wrote dispatches to newspapers throughout the United States describing scenes that she compared to battlefield casualties. Young people whose minds and bodies bore the wounds of a war that most of the world had never recognized was being fought. Sinclair's reporting revealed that the winter crisis had not been limited to French citizens or even to European nationals. Young Americans who had traveled to Paris seeking artistic education and cultural sophistication had been systematically targeted by criminal organizations that recognized their particular vulnerabilities as foreigners without strong local support networks. The isolation that made American expatriates appealing to criminal recruiters also made their disappearance or deterioration less likely to trigger immediate intervention from authorities. The international scope of the victimization created diplomatic complications that French authorities had not anticipated. Embassy officials from multiple countries began demanding explanations for what had happened to their citizens during the winter months. while families throughout Europe and America sought information about relatives who had stopped communicating during the coldest periods of the year. The French government found itself attempting to explain criminal activities that it had failed to detect or prevent. Despite clear evidence that sophisticated organizations had been operating with impunity for years, intelligence agencies from several nations began conducting their own investigations into the criminal networks that had operated during the winter months. Recognizing that the techniques developed in Paris could be replicated in their own countries, the sophistication of the operations impressed even experienced intelligence professionals who noted that the criminal organizations had demonstrated capabilities that rivaled those of established espionage services. The spring investigations revealed that the criminal networks had been far more extensive and better organized than anyone had realized during the crisis itself. What had appeared to be independent groups operating in different neighborhoods were actually components of a single, integrated organization that had divided Paris into territories and specialized functions. Some groups focused on recruitment, others on supply and distribution, still others on maintaining control over established customers and preventing defections or outside interference. The organizational structure that investigators uncovered resembled a sophisticated business enterprise more than traditional criminal gangs. There were detailed records of customer preferences, financial resources, and psychological profiles that had been used to maximize both recruitment effectiveness and profit extraction. Territory maps showed precise boundaries between different operational areas with protocols for cooperation and information sharing that prevented conflicts while ensuring comprehensive coverage of potential targets throughout the city. Most disturbing was evidence that the criminal organizations had been conducting what amounted to systematic research into human vulnerability and manipulation techniques. They had documented which approaches worked best with different personality types, which substances were most effective for creating dependency in various demographic groups, and which environmental conditions maximize their ability to control targets. This research had been compiled into training materials that could be used to replicate their operations in other locations or to train new operatives in proven techniques. The spring of 1929 marked the beginning of what would become the most comprehensive criminal investigation in French history up to that point. Authorities who had been overwhelmed by individual cases during the winter months began to recognize that they were dealing with organized criminal enterprises that required coordinated law enforcement responses. The investigation would eventually involve multiple government agencies, international cooperation, and innovative investigative techniques that had never before been applied to criminal cases. But the investigation also revealed how thoroughly the criminal networks had penetrated legitimate institutions throughout Paris. Evidence emerged of corruption within police departments, medical facilities, and even charitable organizations that had been manipulated or compromised to serve criminal interests. The scope of institutional compromise made it difficult to determine which sources of information could be trusted and which officials might be working to protect rather than prosecute the criminal organizations. The financial investigation proved particularly complex because the criminal networks had developed sophisticated money laundering operations that used legitimate businesses and financial institutions to disguise their profits. They had invested criminal proceeds in real estate, art objects, and business ventures that created the appearance of legitimate wealth while providing ongoing sources of income that could fund future operations. Tracing these financial networks required expertise that few law enforcement agencies possessed at the time. Property records revealed that criminal organizations had systematically acquired buildings throughout the artistic quarters of Paris, using their ownership to control living conditions and create artificial crises that made residents more vulnerable to recruitment. They had also established front businesses that provided legitimate cover for their operations while generating additional revenue and intelligence. Gathering opportunities. The integration of criminal and legitimate activities made it difficult to distinguish between lawful business practices and criminal exploitation. The human cost of the winter months became more apparent as spring progressed and survivors attempted to rebuild their lives. Many found that they had lost not just their health and financial resources, but their entire social networks and professional connections. The artistic communities that had originally attracted them to Paris had been so thoroughly infiltrated and corrupted that returning to previous relationships seemed impossible. They faced the challenge of starting completely over in a city where their recent experiences had made them suspicious of any offers of help or friendship. Families who arrived in Paris seeking to help loved ones recover discovered that the damage extended far beyond simple addiction to substances. Their relatives had undergone personality changes so profound that they seemed like entirely different people. The sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that had been employed during the winter months had created forms of psychological dependency that proved more difficult to overcome than chemical addictions. The spring of 1929 also brought the first attempts at organized treatment for survivors of the winter crisis. Dr. Moreau and a small group of colleagues established what they called recovery communities, residential facilities designed specifically to address the complex combination of physical addiction, psychological manipulation, and social isolation that characterized the winter victims. These facilities represented innovative approaches to treatment that would later influence the development of modern addiction medicine. The recovery communities faced unique challenges because traditional medical approaches proved inadequate for addressing the systematic nature of the exploitation that patients had experienced. Standard detoxification procedures could address the physical aspects of substance addiction, but they did nothing to help patients rebuild their sense of personal identity or reconnect with their original goals and relationships. The psychological manipulation had been so thorough that many patients needed to relearn basic decision-making skills and develop entirely new frameworks for understanding their own desires and capabilities. Treatment protocols developed during this period emphasized community support and gradual reintegration into normal social relationships, rather than individual therapy focused solely on addiction recovery. Patients worked together on artistic projects that helped them reconnect with their original creative interests while providing structured activities that occupied their time and attention. The communal nature of the treatment helped address the isolation that had made patients vulnerable to criminal recruitment, while providing models of healthy relationships based on mutual support rather than exploitation. The success rates of these early treatment programs were mixed, reflecting the severity of the damage that had been inflicted during the winter months. Some patients were able to make significant progress toward recovery and eventually returned to productive lives, though few ever regained the full extent of their previous capabilities or ambitions. Others remained permanently altered by their experiences, unable to form normal relationships or pursue independent goals even after years of treatment and support. The spring investigations also revealed the international scope of the criminal networks and their connections to similar operations in other European cities. Evidence emerged of systematic communication and coordination between criminal groups in Paris, London, Berlin, and other major urban centers where young people gathered seeking artistic and intellectual opportunities. The techniques developed during the Parisian winter months were being exported and adapted to local conditions in other countries. Intelligence agencies began sharing information about criminal methodologies and developing cooperative strategies for addressing what they recognized as a transnational threat to young people throughout Europe. The sophistication of the criminal organizations required equally sophisticated law enforcement responses that could operate across national boundaries and coordinate complex investigations involving multiple jurisdictions. The spring of 1929 marked not just the end of a particularly brutal winter, but the beginning of a new understanding of how organized criminal enterprises could exploit social and cultural institutions for systematic human exploitation. The techniques that had been perfected during the winter months in Paris would influence criminal methodology for decades to come, while the law enforcement responses developed to address the crisis would establish precedents for international cooperation in addressing transnational crime. For the survivors of those winter months, spring brought the beginning of long journeys toward recovery that would extend far beyond the seasonal cycles that had enabled their exploitation. The damage that had been inflicted during the cold months would prove more lasting than the weather patterns that had facilitated it, creating individual tragedies that would echo through families and communities for generations. The city that had promised artistic fulfillment and cultural sophistication had delivered systematic exploitation and human devastation on a scale that few observers had believed possible in civilized society. As investigators continued their work throughout the spring and summer of 1929, they gradually uncovered the full extent of what had transpired. During those winter months, when desperate young people had proven that human nature could be systematically exploited by criminal organizations that understood its vulnerabilities, the lessons learned during this investigation would inform law enforcement approaches to organized crime for decades to come, while the human cost would serve as a permanent reminder of what could happen when criminal enterprises were allowed to operate with impunity in societies that failed to protect their most vulnerable members. The winter crisis in Paris had ended, but its legacy would continue to influence both criminal methodology and law enforcement responses throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The techniques of systematic human exploitation that had been perfected during those brutal winter months would be adapted and refined by criminal organizations around the world, while the investigative and treatment approaches developed in response would establish foundations for modern understanding of organized crime and systematic human trafficking. The revelations that emerged during the spring and summer months painted a picture of criminal sophistication that challenged every assumption law enforcement had previously held about organized crime. Detective Inspector Claude Morrow, who had been assigned to lead the primary investigation, discovered that the winter operations had been supported by an intelligence network that would have impressed military strategists. Criminal organizations had maintained detailed surveillance on potential targets for months before initial contact, gathering information about family backgrounds, financial resources, artistic abilities, and psychological vulnerabilities through networks of informants positioned throughout legitimate cultural institutions. These intelligence operations extended far beyond simple observation. Criminal recruiters had cultivated relationships with landlords, shopkeepers, postal workers, and even medical professionals who provided regular updates about young people who might be experiencing the types of difficulties that made them susceptible to recruitment. The network of informants was so comprehensive that criminal organizations often knew more about potential targets than the individuals knew about themselves, including details about family financial situations, romantic relationships, and personal insecurities that could be exploited during recruitment processes. The timing of recruitment efforts revealed mathematical precision that suggested criminal organizations had developed scientific approaches to human exploitation. They maintained detailed weather records correlated with recruitment success rates, identifying optimal temperature ranges and atmospheric conditions that maximize their ability to approach vulnerable individuals. They tracked seasonal employment patterns in legitimate artistic industries, timing their offers of alternative income opportunities to coincide with periods when conventional work became scarce. Most sophisticated was their use of what investigators termed emotional mapping. Detailed analyses of how different types of stress affected decision-making capabilities in various personality types. Criminal psychologists had apparently studied the effects of cold, hunger, isolation, and financial pressure on human judgment, developing precise formulas for creating combinations of stressors that would make targets most receptive to their approaches. They could predict with remarkable accuracy which individuals would respond to offers of warmth and companionship versus those who would be more susceptible to financial incentives or artistic opportunities. The recruitment process itself had been refined through years of experimentation into a systematic methodology that criminal organizations documented in training materials found during police raids. These materials read like textbooks on psychological manipulation, containing detailed instructions for identifying personality types, creating artificial emotional bonds, and gradually escalating commitments in ways that made retreat increasingly difficult for targets. The criminal organizations had essentially developed industrial processes for converting vulnerable human beings into dependent assets. The physical infrastructure supporting these operations was equally impressive in its scope and sophistication. Criminal organizations had established what amounted to parallel social services systems that could provide housing, food, medical care, and employment opportunities for their targets while maintaining complete control over every aspect of their daily lives. These support systems were designed to replace rather than supplement legitimate social institutions, creating artificial environments where criminal organizations became the sole sources of basic necessities. Housing facilities operated by criminal networks were designed specifically to facilitate control and prevent escape. Buildings were modified with hidden observation points that allowed continuous monitoring of residents, while heating and utility systems were configured to create artificial scarcities that could be manipulated to reward compliance or punish resistance. The physical layout of these facilities made it difficult for residents to maintain private communications or develop relationships that were not supervised by criminal operatives. The medical facilities that criminal organizations established were particularly disturbing in their sophistication. They employed qualified physicians who had been recruited through combinations of financial incentives and professional compromises, creating medical services that appeared legitimate while actually serving to maintain and monitor the health of criminal assets. These facilities could provide genuine medical care when necessary to preserve valuable targets, while also serving as centers for administering substances and monitoring their effects on different individuals. Criminal organizations had also established their own financial institutions that could provide banking services, currency exchange, and credit arrangements for their targets, while maintaining complete records of all transactions. These financial services created additional layers of dependency while generating detailed intelligence about targets, resources, spending patterns, and potential vulnerabilities. The financial institutions also served as money laundering operations that could convert criminal profits into apparently legitimate assets. The educational systems that criminal organizations created represented perhaps their most insidious innovation. They established schools and training programs that appear to offer artistic education and professional development opportunities while actually serving to indoctrinate targets with value systems that normalize criminal activity and discouraged independent thinking. These educational programs use sophisticated psychological techniques to gradually reshape students' understanding of morality, legality, and personal responsibility. Students in these programs were taught that conventional social institutions were corrupt and hypocritical, while criminal organizations represented authentic communities based on genuine mutual support and shared values. The educational curriculum included carefully selected readings from philosophy, literature, and political theory that could be interpreted to justify criminal activity as forms of social rebellion or artistic authenticity. Students were gradually introduced to increasingly radical ideas about the legitimacy of conventional authority and the necessity of alternative social structures. The artistic training provided in these programs was genuine and often of high quality, making it difficult for students to recognize that they were being manipulated rather than educated. Criminal organizations understood that providing real artistic skills served multiple purposes. It created genuine value that justified students' continued participation. It provided cover for criminal activities by establishing legitimate artistic credentials, and it created assets that could generate income through both legal and illegal channels. The summer investigations revealed that criminal organizations had been operating their own publishing houses, art galleries, and performance venues that served as fronts for their activities, while also providing legitimate career opportunities for their targets. These cultural institutions were indistinguishable from legitimate businesses to outside observers, employing real artists and producing genuine cultural products while simultaneously serving as centers for criminal operations. The integration of criminal and legitimate activities was so complete that many targets never fully recognized that they had become involved with criminal organizations. They believed they were participating in alternative cultural movements or progressive artistic communities that happened to operate outside conventional social structures. The criminal organizations had successfully disguised systematic exploitation as cultural innovation and social reform. Law enforcement agencies discovered that dismantling these operations required approaches that had never before been applied to criminal investigations. Traditional methods focused on identifying specific illegal acts and prosecuting individuals responsible for committing them proved inadequate for addressing organizations that had integrated criminal activities so thoroughly into apparently legitimate cultural and social institutions. Investigators needed to develop new techniques for distinguishing between genuine artistic communities and criminal enterprises that used cultural activities as cover. The complexity of these investigations was compounded by the international scope of the criminal networks and their connections to similar operations throughout Europe. Evidence emerged of regular communication and coordination between criminal organizations in different countries, sharing intelligence about targets, techniques, and law enforcement activities. The networks had developed their own diplomatic systems that could facilitate travel and communication across national boundaries while avoiding detection by government authorities. International cooperation in addressing these criminal networks required unprecedented levels of coordination between law enforcement agencies that had previously operated independently within their national jurisdictions. The techniques developed by criminal organizations transcended national boundaries and cultural differences, requiring equally sophisticated international responses that could address transnational criminal enterprises operating across multiple countries simultaneously. The summer of 1929 saw the establishment of what would become the first international task force dedicated to addressing organized criminal exploitation of cultural communities. Representatives from law enforcement agencies throughout Europe began sharing intelligence and coordinating investigations in ways that established precedents for modern international crime-fighting cooperation. The techniques developed during this period would influence law enforcement approaches to transnational organized crime for decades to come. The human impact of these discoveries continued to unfold as investigators uncovered the full scope of victimization that had occurred during the winter months. The numbers of young people who had been systematically exploited was far greater than initial estimates had suggested, with evidence of criminal activity affecting thousands of individuals across multiple European cities. The systematic nature of the exploitation meant that recovery efforts needed to be equally comprehensive and coordinated. Treatment facilities established during the spring months were expanded throughout the summer to address the growing numbers of survivors who were seeking help. The recovery programs developed during this period represented innovations in understanding human psychology and developing therapeutic approaches to address systematic trauma and exploitation. Medical professionals working with survivors documented patterns of psychological damage that had never before been observed or treated. The psychological effects of systematic manipulation proved to be more complex and long-lasting than the physical effects of substance addiction. Survivors struggled with fundamental questions about their own identity, judgment, and ability to form healthy relationships with others. Many expressed profound confusion about their own desires and goals, having been so thoroughly conditioned to serve the interests of criminal organizations that they had lost touch with their original motivations and ambitions. Recovery programs needed to address not just individual psychological damage, but also the social isolation that had made survivors vulnerable to criminal recruitment in the first place. Treatment approaches emphasize community building and peer support while providing structured environments where survivors could gradually rebuild their capacity for independent decision and healthy relationship formation. The artistic communities that had been so thoroughly infiltrated by criminal organizations faced their own challenges in rebuilding legitimate cultural institutions. The revelation that many respected cultural figures had been compromised by criminal networks created suspicion and mistrust that made it difficult to distinguish between genuine artistic leaders and criminal operatives. Legitimate artists and cultural institutions found themselves under scrutiny that made normal cultural activities difficult to maintain. The summer of 1929 marked the beginning of a comprehensive effort to rebuild Paris's artistic communities on foundations that would be more resistant to criminal infiltration. This effort required developing new approaches to supporting young artists that provided adequate resources and community connections while maintaining appropriate safeguards against exploitation. Cultural leaders worked with law enforcement agencies to develop protocols for identifying and reporting suspicious activities while preserving the openness and creativity that made artistic communities valuable. The international attention focused on Paris during this period created opportunities for cultural exchange and cooperation that helped strengthen legitimate artistic institutions while making criminal infiltration more difficult. Artists and cultural leaders from other countries provided support and resources that helped rebuild damaged cultural communities while sharing knowledge about protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. As summer progressed into autumn, the full scope of what had transpired during the previous winter months became clear to investigators, survivors, and the broader public. The systematic exploitation of vulnerable young people had represented a form of organized crime that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and social institutions. The criminal organizations had demonstrated that sophisticated psychological manipulation combined with systematic social isolation could transform ordinary individuals into dependent assets who would serve criminal interests while believing they were pursuing their own goals. The lessons learned during this crisis would influence approaches to understanding and preventing organized crime for generations to come. Law enforcement agencies developed new techniques for identifying and disrupting criminal organizations that used cultural and social institutions as cover for their activities. Treatment professionals gained insights into systematic psychological manipulation that informed therapeutic approaches to helping survivors of organized exploitation. The winter months of 1928 and 1929 in Paris had revealed vulnerabilities in modern urban society that few people had previously recognized or understood. The criminal organizations that had exploited these vulnerabilities had demonstrated capabilities that rivaled those of established government institutions, creating parallel social systems that could provide comprehensive services, while maintaining complete control over the individuals they claimed to serve. The recovery efforts that began in spring and continued through summer represented society's attempt to address these vulnerabilities while preserving the cultural openness and social mobility that made modern urban life attractive to young people seeking artistic and intellectual opportunities. The challenge was to create support systems that could protect vulnerable populations without stifling the creativity and innovation that made cultural communities valuable. As 1929 drew toward its close, the survivors of the winter crisis faced the prospect of their first winter since escaping criminal exploitation. The seasonal cycles that had enabled their original victimization now represented opportunities to test their recovery and demonstrate their ability to maintain independence under conditions that had previously made them vulnerable. For many survivors, successfully navigating another winter season would represent the ultimate measure of their recovery and their ability to build new lives free from criminal influence. The criminal networks operated with such devastating effectiveness during the winter months had been largely dismantled by the comprehensive investigations and international cooperation that followed their exposure. But the techniques they had developed and the vulnerabilities they had exploited remained as permanent reminders of how sophisticated criminal organizations could systematically exploit human nature for profit. Control. The winter crisis of 1928 to 1929 in Paris had ended, but its legacy would continue to influence understanding of organized crime, systematic human exploitation, and the vulnerabilities of modern urban society for decades to come. The young people who had survived those brutal months carried with them knowledge of human darkness that would shape their perspectives for the remainder of their lives, while the institutions that had failed to protect them worked to develop more effective approaches to preventing similar tragedies in the future. The methods used to document and preserve evidence of what had transpired during those winter months revealed the systematic nature of the crisis in ways that shocked even experienced investigators. As autumn arrived in 1929, Detective Inspector Moreau's team discovered that criminal organizations had maintained detailed photographic records of their operations, apparently for training purposes and quality control. These photographs provided visual evidence of the progression from recruitment to complete dependency that had been perfected during the winter months. The photographic archives found in raided facilities contained thousands of images that told stories more compelling than any written testimony could provide. Early photographs showed bright-eyed young people arriving in Paris with their possessions and artistic materials, their faces displaying the hope and excitement that had originally drawn them to the city. Subsequent images documented the gradual transformation that occurred over weeks and months of systematic manipulation and chemical dependency. The progression captured in these photographs was heartbreaking in its predictability. Initial images showed subjects participating in apparently normal social activities, artistic discussions, and cultural events that seemed to represent exactly the type of sophisticated bohemian lifestyle they had sought. but careful examination revealed subtle signs of the manipulation that was already beginning to take hold. The same faces appeared repeatedly in different photographs, suggesting that subjects were being systematically exposed to controlled environments, rather than genuinely diverse social experiences. Later photographs in the sequences showed physical deterioration that occurred with mathematical precision. Weight loss became apparent within weeks of initial contact, while changes in posture and facial expression suggested the influence of substances that affected both physical coordination and emotional responses. The artistic materials that had been prominently displayed in early photographs gradually disappeared from later images, replaced by paraphernalia and personal items that told stories of completely altered priorities and daily routines. The final photographs in many sequences showed individuals who bore little resemblance to the hopeful young artists who had originally been documented. The systematic nature of the transformation suggested that criminal organizations had developed precise methodologies for converting independent creative individuals into dependent assets, who could serve criminal interests while losing their original identities and capabilities. The photographic evidence provided visual proof of systematic human destruction that occurred with industrial efficiency. Medical examinations of these photographs by specialists in human development revealed patterns that had not been apparent during the crisis itself. The physical changes documented in the images suggested exposure to specific combinations of substances administered in carefully controlled doses, designed to create maximum dependency while maintaining basic functionality. The criminal organizations had apparently employed medical professionals who understood exactly how to manipulate human physiology to achieve desired behavioral and psychological outcomes. The psychological changes captured in the photographs were even more disturbing than the physical deterioration. Early images showed subjects displaying normal ranges of emotional expression and social interaction, while later photographs revealed the flat affect and social withdrawal that characterized advanced stages of systematic manipulation. The transformation of personality and emotional capacity appeared to follow predictable patterns that suggested criminal organizations had developed precise techniques for reshaping human psychology according to their operational requirements. Handwriting analysis of documents found alongside the photographic archives provided additional evidence of the systematic nature of the psychological manipulation. Letters, artistic works, and personal journals created by subjects showed progressive deterioration in cognitive function that paralleled the physical changes documented in photographs. Early writings displayed normal intellectual capacity and emotional depth, while later documents revealed confused thinking, impaired memory, and emotional detachment that suggested severe neurological damage. The criminal organizations had apparently maintained these records as part of comprehensive research programs designed to refine their techniques and improve their operational efficiency. They treated human exploitation as a scientific endeavor that could be studied, measured, and optimized through systematic experimentation and careful documentation of results. The archives contained detailed analyses comparing the effectiveness of different manipulation techniques with various personality types and demographic groups. Research notes found in these archives revealed that criminal organizations had been conducting what amounted to controlled experiments on human subjects, testing the effects of different substances, environmental conditions, and psychological pressures to determine optimal combinations for achieving complete control over targets. These experiments had been conducted with scientific rigor that would have impressed legitimate researchers, complete with control groups, statistical analyses, and peer review processes within the criminal organizations. The international scope of this research became apparent as investigators discovered evidence of communication between criminal organizations in different countries, sharing experimental results and refining techniques based on collective experience. The criminal networks had established their own academic institutions that could conduct research, publish findings, and train new operatives in proven methodologies for systematic human exploitation. The autumn investigations revealed that criminal organizations had been planning to expand their operations far beyond the artistic communities of Paris. Evidence emerged of systematic surveys conducted in other European cities, identifying potential targets and optimal locations for establishing similar operations. The techniques perfected during the Parisian winter months were being prepared for export to other urban centers with significant populations of vulnerable young people. Intelligence documents captured during raids contained detailed analyses of cultural and economic conditions in cities throughout Europe, identifying factors that would facilitate criminal operations and potential obstacles that would need to be overcome. The criminal organizations had developed sophisticated understanding of how different social and political systems could be exploited or circumvented to enable systematic human trafficking and exploitation. The planning documents revealed ambitions that extended far beyond simple criminal profit. Criminal organizations were apparently working toward establishing parallel social systems that could compete with legitimate government institutions in providing services and maintaining social order. They envisioned creating alternative societies where criminal organizations would serve as primary authorities, providing housing, employment, education, and social services while maintaining complete control over populations that would serve their interests. These alternative social systems would be established gradually by infiltrating and eventually replacing legitimate institutions in specific geographic areas or demographic communities. The criminal organizations planned to position themselves as more effective and responsive alternatives to government agencies that were supposedly corrupt, inefficient, or indifferent to the needs of vulnerable populations. The systematic exploitation of individuals would be disguised as social reform and community building. The sophistication of these long-term plans impressed even experienced intelligence analysts who recognized that criminal organizations had developed strategic thinking capabilities that rivaled those of legitimate government institutions. The criminal networks were not simply reacting to opportunities for immediate profit, but were working toward fundamental transformations of social organization that would provide them with permanent sources of power and resources. Law enforcement agencies realized that addressing these criminal organizations required approaches that went far beyond traditional crime-fighting techniques. The networks had developed capabilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying modern legal and political systems. Their ability to provide comprehensive social services while maintaining complete control over individuals created alternatives to legitimate governance that could appeal to populations experiencing economic hardship or social displacement. The autumn months brought increasing recognition that the winter crisis had been just one component of a much larger challenge to establish social and political order throughout Europe. The criminal organizations that had perfected their techniques during the brutal months in Paris were working towards systematic transformation of urban society that would create permanent criminal control over significant populations. International cooperation in addressing these threats required unprecedented levels of coordination between government agencies that had previously operated independently. The criminal networks transcended national boundaries and traditional jurisdictional divisions, requiring equally sophisticated responses that could address transnational criminal enterprises operating across multiple countries and social systems simultaneously. The establishment of international task forces during this period created new models for cooperation that would influence government responses to organized crime for decades to come. Law enforcement agencies began sharing intelligence and coordinating operations in ways that established precedents for modern international crime-fighting cooperation, while also raising questions about national sovereignty and jurisdictional authority. The human cost of the criminal operations continued to unfold as autumn progressed and more survivors sought treatment for the systematic exploitation they had experienced. Treatment facilities established during the spring and summer months were expanded to address growing numbers of individuals who had been affected by criminal operations throughout Europe. The therapeutic approaches developed during this period represented innovations in understanding systematic trauma and developing effective treatment methodologies. Recovery programs faced unique challenges because survivors had been systematically conditioned to distrust all forms of authority and social institutions. The criminal organizations had deliberately undermined their targets' ability to form healthy relationships or make independent decisions, creating psychological damage that extended far beyond simple substance addiction. Survivors needed to rebuild fundamental capacities for trust, judgment, and social interaction that had been systematically destroyed during their exploitation. The artistic communities that had been infiltrated by criminal organizations worked throughout the autumn months to rebuild legitimate cultural institutions that could provide support and opportunities for young artists without creating vulnerabilities to criminal exploitation. This effort required developing new approaches to community building that could provide adequate resources and social connections while maintaining appropriate safeguards against systematic manipulation. Cultural leaders collaborated with law enforcement agencies to develop protocols for identifying and reporting suspicious activities while preserving the openness and creativity that made artistic communities valuable. The challenge was to create support systems that could protect vulnerable individuals without stifling the innovation and experimentation that attracted young people to artistic careers in major urban centers. As winter approached again, survivors of the previous year's crisis faced their first test of recovery under conditions that had originally made them vulnerable to criminal exploitation. The seasonal cycles that had enabled systematic exploitation now represented opportunities to demonstrate recovery and resilience. Treatment programs prepared survivors for the psychological challenges that cold weather and reduced daylight might create, while law enforcement agencies maintained heightened vigilance for any signs of renewed criminal activity. The winter of 1929 to 1930 passed without the systematic exploitation that had characterized the previous year, but the vigilance required to prevent renewed criminal activity demonstrated the ongoing nature of the threat. Criminal organizations had been disrupted rather than completely eliminated, and the vulnerabilities that had enabled their original success remained present in urban societies throughout Europe. The success in preventing renewed exploitation during the winter months represented a victory for the coordinated international response that had been developed following the crisis. But law enforcement agencies and treatment professionals recognized that maintaining this success would require ongoing vigilance and continued development of more effective approaches to protecting vulnerable populations from systematic criminal exploitation. The techniques developed by criminal organizations during the winter months of 1928-1929 had demonstrated vulnerabilities in modern urban society that could not be permanently eliminated through law enforcement action alone. Addressing these vulnerabilities required fundamental changes in how societies provided support and opportunities for young people seeking artistic and intellectual development in major urban centers. The lessons learned during this crisis continued to influence approaches to understanding and preventing organized crime throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The systematic nature of the exploitation that had occurred during those winter months provided insights into criminal psychology and organizational capabilities that informed law enforcement strategies for addressing sophisticated criminal enterprises. The survivors who had experienced systematic exploitation during those brutal winter months carried with them knowledge of human vulnerability and resilience that would influence their perspectives throughout their lives. Many became advocates for protecting other vulnerable populations from similar exploitation, using their experiences to develop more effective approaches to prevention and treatment. The winter crisis of 1928 to 1929 in Paris had revealed the potential for systematic criminal exploitation of human vulnerability on scales that few people had previously imagined possible. The criminal organizations that had operated with such devastating effectiveness had demonstrated that sophisticated psychological manipulation combined with systematic social control could transform ordinary individuals into dependent assets serving criminal interests. The response to this crisis had required innovations in law enforcement cooperation, treatment methodologies, and social support systems that established precedents for addressing organized crime and systematic human exploitation. The techniques developed during this period continued to influence approaches to protecting vulnerable populations and dismantling criminal organizations for generations to come. As the anniversary of those brutal winter months approached, survivors, law enforcement agencies, and communities throughout Europe reflected on the lessons learned and the ongoing challenges of protecting human dignity and freedom in societies that remained vulnerable to sophisticated criminal exploitation. The memory of what had transpired during those frozen months served as a permanent reminder of what could happen when criminal organizations were allowed to operate with systematic precision against vulnerable populations who sought nothing more. Opportunities to pursue their artistic and intellectual aspirations in the cultural centers of European civilization. The documentation that survived from those final winter months reveals how criminal networks had begun developing what they've termed memory reconstruction protocols, sophisticated techniques designed to alter survivors' recollections of their experiences in ways that would prevent effective testimony against criminal operators. These protocols were discovered in encrypted journals found during raids conducted throughout the winter of 1929 to 1930, providing investigators with chilling insights into the psychological sophistication that criminal organizations had achieved. The memory reconstruction techniques involved systematic exposure to carefully crafted narratives that gradually replaced authentic memories with false recollections that portrayed criminal exploitation as positive experiences. Survivors would be repeatedly told stories about their time in criminal networks that emphasized the warmth, friendship, and artistic opportunities they had supposedly received, while minimizing or completely eliminating memories of coercion, addiction, and systematic abuse. These false memory implantation procedures were conducted by individuals who possessed genuine expertise in human psychology and memory formation. Criminal organizations had recruited licensed physicians and academic researchers who applied legitimate scientific knowledge to serve criminal purposes. The techniques they developed were based on real understanding of how human memory functions and how it could be systematically manipulated through combinations of chemical intervention and psychological conditioning. The process typically began during the final stages of a victim's involvement with criminal networks, when operators recognized that circumstances might eventually lead to law enforcement intervention or family rescue efforts, rather than simply releasing victims who had become too expensive or difficult to maintain. Criminal organizations would subject them to intensive memory modification procedures designed to ensure their silence and prevent accurate testimony about criminal activities. Victims undergoing memory reconstruction would be isolated in controlled environments, where they were exposed to carefully designed combinations of substances that affected memory formation, while being repeatedly presented with false narratives about their experiences. The procedures could last for weeks or months, during which victims would gradually lose access to accurate memories of their exploitation, while developing detailed recollections of events that had never actually occurred. The false memories that were implanted typically portrayed criminal operators as benevolent mentors who had provided essential support during difficult periods in victims' lives. Memories of drug addiction would be replaced with recollections of medical treatment for legitimate health problems. Memories of coercion and manipulation would be transformed into stories of friendship and mutual support among artistic communities. Medical examinations of survivors who had undergone these procedures revealed neurological changes that suggested systematic damage to brain regions responsible for memory formation and retrieval. The chemical substances used during memory reconstruction apparently caused permanent alteration to neural pathways that made it extremely difficult for victims to distinguish between authentic memories and implanted false recollections. Dr. Elizabeth Morrow, who had been working with survivors throughout the recovery process, documented cases where individuals could provide detailed, emotionally compelling accounts of experiences that investigation proved had never occurred. These false memories were often more vivid and emotionally resonant than authentic recollections, making it nearly impossible for survivors themselves to recognize which memories were real and which had been artificially created. The implications of these memory reconstruction techniques extended far beyond their immediate use in preventing criminal testimony. The procedures demonstrated that criminal organizations had developed capabilities for systematically altering human consciousness and identity in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about personal autonomy and the reliability of human testimony in legal proceedings. Law enforcement agencies discovered that traditional investigative techniques were inadequate for addressing crimes where victims had been systematically programmed to provide false testimony that would protect rather than incriminate their exploiters. Developing effective responses required innovations in forensic psychology and legal procedures that could distinguish between authentic testimony and implanted false memories. The winter of 1929 to 1930 brought renewed attempts by remnants of criminal organizations to re-establish operations using refined techniques based on lessons learned during the previous year's crisis. These renewed criminal activities were more subtle and harder to detect than the systematic exploitation that had characterized the earlier period, reflecting criminal adaptation to increase law enforcement vigilance and public awareness. Intelligence reports from this period describe ghost networks that operated with minimal physical infrastructure while maintaining psychological control over small numbers of carefully selected targets. These networks avoided the large-scale operations that had made previous criminal activities visible to authorities, instead focusing on intensive manipulation of individuals who could serve as long-term assets without attracting attention. The ghost networks used what investigators termed distributed control, maintaining influence over targets through networks of handlers who appeared to be legitimate members of artistic communities, but who were actually criminal operatives trained in advanced psychological manipulation techniques. These handlers could maintain control over targets while remaining virtually invisible to law enforcement surveillance. Targets of ghost network operations were typically individuals who had demonstrated particular vulnerabilities or who possessed specific skills or connections that made them valuable to criminal organizations. Rather than recruiting large numbers of victims through systematic campaigns, ghost networks focused on intensive cultivation of carefully selected individuals who could provide maximum value with minimum risk of detection. The psychological techniques used by ghost networks were more sophisticated than anything previously documented, incorporating advances in understanding of human psychology that criminal organizations had developed through their systematic research programs. These techniques could create profound psychological dependencies without requiring the obvious physical control mechanisms that had characterized earlier criminal operations. Survivors of ghost network operations presented unique challenges for treatment professionals because their exploitation had been so subtle and psychologically sophisticated that they often remained unaware that they had been victimized. Many continued to believe that they were participants in legitimate artistic communities or progressive social movements, making it extremely difficult to provide appropriate treatment or gather evidence for criminal prosecutions. The detection of ghost network activities required law enforcement agencies to develop new surveillance techniques that could identify criminal operations that left minimal physical evidence while creating maximum psychological impact. Traditional investigative methods proved inadequate for addressing criminal activities that operated primarily through psychological manipulation rather than obvious coercion or physical control. International cooperation became even more crucial during this period as intelligence agencies discovered that ghost networks were operating across national boundaries with unprecedented sophistication. The networks use legitimate cultural exchange programs, artistic collaborations, and academic conferences as cover for maintaining international communication and coordination between criminal operatives in different countries. The cultural institutions that had been rebuilt following the original crisis found themselves facing new challenges as ghost networks attempted to infiltrate legitimate artistic communities through operatives who possessed genuine cultural credentials and could contribute meaningfully to artistic activities while serving criminal purposes. Distinguishing between authentic cultural participants and criminal infiltrators required constant vigilance and sophisticated assessment techniques. Artists and cultural leaders developed informal networks for sharing information about suspicious activities while working to maintain the openness and creativity that made artistic communities valuable. This required delicate balancing between necessary security measures and preservation of the trust and collaboration that enabled genuine artistic innovation and cultural development. The spring of 1930 brought evidence that ghost network operations were being coordinated with broader criminal enterprises that extended far beyond the exploitation of artistic communities. Intelligence reports suggested connections between the networks that had originally targeted artists and larger criminal organizations involved in international trafficking, financial fraud, and political subversion. These connections implied that the techniques developed for exploiting vulnerable artists were being adapted for use against other populations and for purposes that extended beyond simple criminal profit. The systematic approaches to psychological manipulation and social control that had been perfected through exploitation of artistic communities were apparently being applied to achieve broader criminal and political objectives. Law enforcement agencies realized that addressing these expanded criminal threats required approaches that went beyond traditional crime-fighting techniques. The criminal organizations had evolved into sophisticated enterprises that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between legitimate authority and criminal activity, creating alternative power structures that could compete with established social institutions. The summer months brought international conferences where law enforcement agencies, treatment professionals, and cultural leaders shared information and developed coordinated strategies for addressing the ongoing threats posed by evolved criminal organizations. These conferences established new frameworks for international cooperation while also highlighting the complexity of challenges that extended far beyond the original winter crisis in Paris. Treatment facilities continued to develop innovative approaches for helping survivors of both the original systematic exploitation and the more subtle ghost network operations. The therapeutic techniques that emerged during this period represented advances in understanding systematic psychological trauma that would influence treatment methodologies for decades to come. Recovery programs expanded to address the broader implications of systematic psychological manipulation, recognizing that the techniques developed by criminal organizations had applications that extended far beyond the specific context of artistic community exploitation. Survivors of criminal manipulation often possessed insights into psychological vulnerability and resilience that proved valuable for protecting other populations from similar threats. The autumn of 1930 marked what investigators would later recognize as the final phase of criminal operations that had originated during the winter crisis of 1928-1929. The comprehensive international response that had been developed over the preceding months had successfully disrupted criminal networks while establishing protective systems that made systematic exploitation much more difficult to achieve. However, the techniques and knowledge that criminal organizations had developed during their operations did not disappear with the dismantling of specific networks. The psychological manipulation methods, organizational structures, and operational techniques that had been perfected during the crisis continued to influence criminal activity throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The legacy of those brutal winter months extended far beyond the immediate victims and survivors who had directly experienced systematic exploitation. The crisis had revealed vulnerabilities in modern urban society that required ongoing vigilance and continued development of protective systems to prevent similar systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. Educational institutions began incorporating information about psychological manipulation and systematic exploitation into curricula designed to help young people recognize and resist criminal recruitment efforts. These educational programs were based on knowledge gained through investigation of criminal operations and treatment of survivors, providing practical information that could help protect future generations from similar threats. Cultural institutions developed new approaches to supporting young artists that provided adequate resources and community connections while maintaining appropriate safeguards against criminal infiltration. These support systems were designed to address the legitimate needs that had made young people vulnerable to criminal exploitation while preventing the isolation and desperation that criminal organizations had systematically exploited. The winter of 1930 to 1931 passed without significant criminal activity targeting artistic communities, marking the first winter season since the original crisis when systematic exploitation did not occur. This success represented a victory for the coordinated international response that had been developed. But law enforcement agencies and treatment professionals recognize that maintaining this success would require continued vigilance and ongoing development of protective measures. The approaches developed for addressing the winter crisis established precedents for international cooperation in combating organized crime that continued to influence law enforcement strategies. Throughout the remainder of the 20th century, the techniques for identifying and dismantling sophisticated criminal networks, treating survivors of systematic exploitation, and protecting vulnerable populations became standard components of modern approaches to organized crime prevention. As the decade drew to a close, survivors of the winter crisis had largely rebuilt their lives, though many carried permanent psychological and physical effects from their experiences. The artistic communities that had been so thoroughly infiltrated and damaged by criminal operations had successfully re-established themselves on more secure foundations that provided better protection for vulnerable members while maintaining the creativity and innovation that made cultural communities valuable. The memory of those brutal winter months when desperate young people had discovered that human nature could be systematically exploited by criminal organizations that understood its vulnerabilities served as a permanent reminder of the importance of protecting human dignity and freedom in societies that remained vulnerable to sophisticated criminal manipulation. The techniques of systematic human exploitation that had been developed during those frozen months in Paris had been successfully countered through coordinated international response, innovative treatment approaches, and fundamental changes in how societies provided support for vulnerable populations. But the knowledge that such systematic exploitation was possible continued to influence understanding of human vulnerability and the importance of maintaining vigilant protection of human rights and individual autonomy. The winter crisis had ended, but its lessons remained as permanent contributions to human understanding of both potential for systematic criminal exploitation and the possibilities for effective response through coordinated international cooperation, innovative treatment methodologies, and comprehensive social support systems that could protect vulnerable populations while preserving the openness and creativity that made human civilization valuable and worth defending. The documentation efforts that began in earnest during the final months of 1930 revealed layers of criminal sophistication that investigators had not fully grasped even after 2 years of intensive investigation. As winter approached once again, Detective Inspector Morrow's expanded team discovered what they termed legacy protocols, systematic procedures that criminal organizations had developed to ensure their techniques and knowledge would survive, even if their immediate operations were completely dismantled. These legacy protocols were hidden in locations throughout Paris that had never been associated with criminal activities, embedded within legitimate businesses, cultural institutions, and even government offices through networks of compromised individuals who had been systematically placed in positions of influence over periods of years. The protocols contain detailed instructions for reactivating criminal operations, complete operational manuals, and lists of potential targets and assets that could be exploited when conditions became favorable again. The discovery of these legacy systems forced investigators to recognize that they had been addressing only the visible components of criminal enterprises that possessed far greater depth and resilience than anyone had previously understood. The networks that had operated during the winter months were apparently designed to be expendable front operations that could be sacrificed to protect more valuable core systems that remained hidden and operational. Intelligence analysis of the legacy protocols revealed criminal organizations that thought in terms of decades rather than seasons, developing strategies that could survive multiple cycles of law enforcement disruption while gradually expanding their influence and capabilities. They had created what amounted to criminal institutions that could persist across generations, passing knowledge and resources from one group of operators to the next through carefully maintained succession systems. The psychological research that criminal organizations had conducted during their active operations had been preserved in forms that could be accessed and continued by future operators. Hidden archives contained thousands of case studies documenting the effects of different manipulation techniques on various personality types, along with statistical analyses that could guide future recruitment and control efforts. This research represented a systematic study of human vulnerability that rivaled anything conducted by legitimate academic institutions. Medical facilities that had served criminal operations contained equipment and supplies that suggested ongoing research into chemical methods for controlling human behavior and memory. Laboratory spaces hidden within apparently legitimate medical practices contained sophisticated equipment for synthesizing substances that could affect consciousness, memory formation, and decision-making capabilities. The level of medical expertise required for these operations indicated that criminal organizations had recruited qualified professionals who continued their work even after front operations had been dismantled. Financial investigations revealed that criminal organizations had established endowment systems that could provide funding for future operations through investments in legitimate businesses and financial instruments. These endowments were structured to generate income over extended periods while remaining invisible to routine financial oversight. The criminal networks had essentially created their own foundations that could support renewed activities when circumstances became favorable. The international scope of these legacy systems became apparent as investigators in other European cities discovered similar hidden protocols and resource caches. The criminal organizations had apparently established redundant systems across multiple countries that could support each other and share resources when individual components were compromised. The sophistication of these international networks suggested coordination at levels that challenged the capabilities of legitimate government institutions. Cultural institutions throughout Europe began conducting their own investigations to identify potential infiltration by criminal operatives who might have been placed in positions of influence during the active phases of criminal operations. These investigations revealed that criminal organizations had systematically placed individuals in museums, galleries, schools, and cultural organizations where they could influence policy decisions and identify potential targets for future exploitation. The revelation that criminal operatives had been embedded within legitimate institutions for years raised disturbing questions about the integrity of cultural and educational systems throughout Europe. Institutions that had believed themselves to be serving legitimate cultural purposes discovered that some of their most trusted members had actually been serving criminal interests while maintaining perfect facades of professional competence and cultural commitment. Educational institutions faced particular challenges in identifying compromised personnel because criminal operatives had often made genuine contributions to academic and cultural activities while serving hidden criminal purposes. Distinguishing between legitimate cultural leaders and criminal infiltrators required careful analysis of patterns of influence and decision-making that might have served criminal rather than institutional interests. The winter of 1930 to 1931 brought new forms of criminal activity that seemed designed to test the effectiveness of protective systems that had been established following the original crisis. These activities were subtle and difficult to detect, involving psychological manipulation techniques that left minimal physical evidence, while creating significant psychological impact on carefully selected targets. Law enforcement agencies developed new surveillance methodologies specifically designed to detect criminal activities that operated primarily through psychological manipulation, rather than obvious coercion or physical control. These methodologies required training officers in advanced psychology and providing them with resources for long-term observation of suspect individuals and organizations. The treatment facilities that had been established to help survivors of the original crisis expanded their missions to address new forms of psychological manipulation that were being employed by evolved criminal organizations. Treatment professionals developed innovative therapeutic approaches that could help individuals recognize and resist subtle forms of psychological control that might not be immediately apparent to victims themselves. International cooperation reached new levels of sophistication as law enforcement agencies shared intelligence about criminal techniques and coordinated responses to threats that transcended national boundaries. The protocols developed during this period established frameworks for international crime fighting that continued to influence law enforcement cooperation for decades to come. Cultural communities throughout Europe worked to develop new approaches to supporting young artists that could provide adequate resources and community connections while maintaining robust protections against criminal exploitation. These efforts required balancing openness and creativity with necessary security measures that could prevent systematic manipulation and control. The spring of 1931 brought evidence that criminal organizations were adapting their techniques to exploit new vulnerabilities created by economic instability and political uncertainty throughout Europe. The global economic crisis that had begun in 1929 was creating conditions of desperation and displacement that criminal organizations recognized as opportunities for renewed systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. Intelligence reports described criminal recruitment efforts that targeted individuals who had lost employment or financial resources due to economic conditions, offering them opportunities that appeared to address their immediate needs, while gradually introducing them to criminal activities. These recruitment efforts were more sophisticated than previous operations, incorporating lessons learned during the earlier crisis, while adapting to change social and economic conditions. The economic crisis also created challenges for the treatment facilities and support systems that had been established to protect vulnerable populations and help survivors of criminal exploitation. Reduced government funding and increased demand for services strained resources, while criminal organizations took advantage of weakened social safety nets to expand their operations. Law enforcement agencies recognized that addressing criminal exploitation during periods of economic instability required approaches that went beyond traditional crime-fighting techniques. They needed to work with social service organizations, cultural institutions, and international partners to maintain protective systems while addressing the broader economic and social conditions that made populations vulnerable to systematic exploitation. The summer months brought international conferences where representatives from government agencies, treatment facilities, cultural institutions, and survivor advocacy groups shared information and developed coordinated strategies for addressing ongoing threats. These conferences established new frameworks for cooperation that could address both immediate criminal activities and the broader social vulnerabilities that enabled systematic exploitation. Survivor advocacy groups that had formed during the recovery process became increasingly important voices in developing policies and programs designed to protect vulnerable populations. Survivors who had experienced systematic exploitation possessed unique insights into criminal techniques and victim psychology that proved invaluable for developing effective prevention and treatment approaches. The autumn of 1931 marked what historians would later recognize as the final resolution of the criminal crisis that had begun during the winter months of 1928-1929. The comprehensive international response that had been developed over the preceding years had successfully dismantled criminal networks while establishing protective systems that made systematic exploitation extremely difficult to achieve and maintain. However, the knowledge and techniques that criminal organizations had developed during their operations continued to influence criminal activity and law enforcement responses throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The psychological manipulation methods, organizational structures, and operational techniques that had been documented during the crisis became part of the permanent knowledge base that informed understanding of organized crime and systematic human exploitation. Educational institutions incorporated information about systematic exploitation and psychological manipulation into curricula designed to help future generations recognize and resist criminal recruitment efforts. These educational programs were based on direct knowledge gained through investigation of criminal operations and treatment of survivors, providing practical information that could help protect young people from similar threats. Treatment professionals continue to refine therapeutic approaches for helping survivors of systematic psychological manipulation, developing techniques that address the complex combinations of trauma, conditioning, and identity alteration that characterize victims of sophisticated criminal exploitation. These treatment methodologies became standard components of modern approaches to trauma therapy and victim rehabilitation. Cultural institutions established new protocols for supporting vulnerable populations, while maintaining appropriate safeguards against criminal infiltration. These protocols balanced the need for openness and creativity with security measures that could prevent systematic manipulation and exploitation of community members. The legacy of those brutal winter months extended far beyond the immediate victims and survivors who had directly experienced systematic exploitation. The crisis had revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in modern society that required ongoing vigilance and continued development of protective systems to prevent similar abuse of human dignity and individual autonomy. As the decade progressed, the approaches developed for addressing the winter crisis became integral components of modern understanding of organized crime, systematic human exploitation, and the protection of vulnerable populations. The techniques for international cooperation, innovative treatment approaches, and comprehensive social support systems established precedents that continue to influence policy and practice for generations to come. The memory of those frozen months when desperate young people had discovered that human nature could be systematically exploited by criminal organizations served as a permanent reminder of both human vulnerability and the possibilities for effective response through coordinated action, scientific understanding, and unwavering commitment to protecting human dignity and freedom in societies that remained vulnerable to sophisticated criminal manipulation. The winter crisis had demonstrated that even the most systematic and sophisticated criminal exploitation could be successfully addressed through comprehensive international cooperation. Innovative treatment methodologies and fundamental changes in how societies provided support for vulnerable populations. The lessons learned during those difficult years continued to inform efforts to protect human rights and individual autonomy long after the immediate crisis had been resolved. The techniques of systematic human exploitation that had been developed and refined during those winter months in Paris had been successfully countered, but the knowledge that such exploitation was possible remained as a permanent contribution to human understanding of both the potential for criminal manipulation and the possibilities for effective resistance through coordinated response, scientific understanding, an unwavering commitment to protecting the values that made human civilization worth defending and preserving. Preserving the transformation of Paris occurred during the winter of 1932, revealed the lasting psychological scars that those brutal months had carved into the city's collective consciousness even 3 years after the systematic criminal operations had been dismantled. The mere arrival of the first frost would trigger a citywide anxiety that manifested in ways both subtle and profound. Café owners throughout Montparnasse and Saint-Germain-des-Prés noticed patterns that had become as predictable as the seasonal changes themselves. As temperatures dropped below freezing, their regular customers would begin exhibiting behaviors that spoke to deeper trauma than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Young artists who had never experienced the original crisis would unconsciously avoid certain establishments that had once served as recruitment centers, despite having no rational knowledge of their dark histories. The phenomenon that Dr. Elizabeth Morrow termed inherited vigilance began appearing in individuals who had arrived in Paris well after the criminal networks had been destroyed. These newcomers would display instinctive weariness of exactly the types of social situations and offers of assistance that had originally made people vulnerable to exploitation. It was as if the city itself had developed an immune system that could recognize and respond to threats even when conscious awareness provided no explanation for the response. Building superintendents reported that tenant behavior during winter months had fundamentally changed compared to pre-crisis patterns, where once young people had eagerly sought out communal gathering spaces and social activities during cold weather. They now displayed marked preferences for maintaining independence and avoiding situations where they might become dependent on others for basic necessities like warmth, food, or shelter. The architectural modifications that property owners had made throughout the artistic quarters told their own story of how the crisis had permanently altered the physical landscape of the city. Postal services documented changes in correspondence, patterns that reflected the lasting impact of communication control techniques that criminal organizations had employed. Families throughout Europe had developed new protocols for maintaining contact with young relatives living in major cities using coded language and verification systems that could detect if letters were being intercepted or if responses were being influenced by unauthorized third parties. These communication security measures had become so widespread that postal workers were trained to recognize signs of suspicious mail handling or unusual patterns in correspondence that might indicate renewed criminal activity. The systems developed for detecting communication interference had become permanent components of international mail security protocols that extended far beyond protection of artistic communities. The medical community continued to document long-term effects of the systematic exploitation that had occurred during the crisis years. Survivors who had undergone memory reconstruction procedures displayed neurological patterns that remained detectable years after their experiences, creating a population of individuals whose testimony about their own experiences remained fundamentally unreliable due to the sophisticated psychological manipulation they had endured. Dr. Morrow's research revealed that the memory reconstruction techniques had created permanent alterations in brain chemistry that affected not just recollection of specific events, but overall capacity for forming and maintaining accurate memories of personal experiences. Survivors often struggled with fundamental questions about their own identity and personal history that extended far beyond the specific period of their criminal exploitation. These neurological changes had implications that extended beyond individual recovery to broader questions about the reliability of human testimony in legal proceedings and the potential for systematic manipulation of witness accounts. The techniques that criminal organizations had developed for altering memory and perception had demonstrated vulnerabilities in human consciousness that challenge fundamental assumptions about personal autonomy, integrity of individual experience. Treatment facilities had evolved beyond their original mission of helping survivors recover from criminal exploitation to become research centers studying the broader implications of systematic psychological manipulation. The therapeutic approaches developed during the crisis had proven effective for addressing other forms of trauma and coercive control, leading to innovations in mental health treatment that benefited populations far beyond the original victims. Educational institutions throughout Europe had incorporated the lessons learned during the crisis into curricula designed to help young people recognize and resist various forms of manipulation and exploitation. These educational programs went beyond simple warnings about criminal recruitment to provide comprehensive training in critical thinking, psychological awareness, and personal safety techniques. The cultural institutions that had been rebuilt following the crisis had developed new models for supporting artistic communities that balanced creativity and openness with appropriate safeguards against exploitation. These models had been studied and replicated in other cities and countries, creating international networks of cultural organizations that shared best practices for protecting vulnerable populations while fostering artistic innovation. International cooperation in addressing organized crime had reached levels of sophistication that would have been unimaginable before the crisis. Law enforcement agencies had established permanent channels for sharing intelligence and coordinating responses to transnational criminal activities while maintaining respect for national sovereignty and individual rights that had been reinforced by recognition of how easily institutional authority could be corrupted or manipulated. The financial investigation techniques developed during the crisis had revealed previously unknown methods for tracking criminal assets and disrupting illegal financial networks. These techniques had been adapted for addressing other forms of organized crime and had become standard components of modern financial crime investigation methodologies that continued to evolve in response to increasingly sophisticated criminal enterprises. The winter of 1932 marked a significant milestone in the recovery process as it became the first winter season when survivor support groups reported no relapses or psychological crises related to seasonal changes. This achievement represented successful adaptation to environmental conditions that had once triggered profound psychological distress in individuals who had experienced systematic exploitation during winter months. Treatment professionals recognized this milestone as evidence that comprehensive therapeutic approaches could successfully address even the most sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation and trauma. The recovery programs that had been developed during the crisis had proven capable of helping individuals rebuild their capacity for independent thought and autonomous decision-making even after experiencing systematic conditioning designed to eliminate these capabilities. The success of survivor recovery programs had broader implications for understanding human resilience and the potential for healing from systematic trauma. The therapeutic techniques that had proven effective with survivors of criminal exploitation were being adapted for use with other populations who had experienced various forms of systematic abuse, coercion, or manipulation. Cultural communities throughout Europe celebrated the winter of 1932 as a return to normal seasonal patterns of artistic activity and community gathering. The fear and isolation that had characterized winter months during and immediately after the crisis had been replaced by renewed confidence in the safety and integrity of cultural institutions and artistic communities. Young artists arriving in major European cities for the first time were now welcomed with comprehensive orientation programs that provided both practical support and education about personal safety and community resources. These programs were designed to address the legitimate needs that had originally made young people vulnerable to criminal exploitation, while providing them with knowledge and resources that could protect them from various forms of manipulation and abuse. The orientation programs included training in recognizing signs of systematic manipulation, understanding personal rights and legal protections, and accessing legitimate support services that could provide assistance during difficult periods without creating dependencies that could be exploited. These educational components had become standard elements of support systems for vulnerable populations in urban centers throughout Europe. The spring of 1933 brought renewed international conferences where representatives from law enforcement agencies, treatment facilities, cultural institutions, and survivor advocacy groups continued to share information and refine approaches to protecting vulnerable populations. These conferences had become annual events that served both to maintain vigilance against renewed criminal threats and to celebrate the ongoing success of recovery and protection efforts. The conferences also provided opportunities to document and preserve the institutional knowledge that had been gained through experience with systematic criminal exploitation. This knowledge was being compiled into training materials and reference resources that could be used to prepare future generations of law enforcement officers, treatment professionals, and community leaders to recognize and respond to similar threats. Survivor advocacy groups had evolved into permanent organizations that provided ongoing support for individuals who had experienced systematic exploitation, while also serving as resources for developing policies and programs designed to protect other vulnerable populations. These organizations had become important voices in discussions about human rights, individual autonomy, and the responsibilities of institutions to protect the people they served. The advocacy groups also maintained networks for sharing information about potential criminal activities and coordinating responses to emerging threats. These networks provided early warning systems that could detect patterns of suspicious activity before they developed into systematic exploitation campaigns, allowing for preventive interventions that could protect potential victims before they experienced harm. The summer months brought evidence that the comprehensive international response to the crisis had successfully prevented the development of similar systematic exploitation campaigns in other locations. Intelligence agencies reported that attempts to establish criminal operations similar to those that had operated in Paris had been detected and disrupted in their early stages through application of knowledge gained during the original crisis. The success in preventing renewed systematic exploitation demonstrated that the approaches developed during the crisis could be effectively applied to protect vulnerable populations from similar threats in different contexts and locations. The techniques for early detection, rapid response, and comprehensive intervention had proven transferable across different cultural and political environments. Law enforcement agencies continue to refine their capabilities for addressing sophisticated criminal organizations that use psychological manipulation and social control rather than obvious coercion or violence. The investigative techniques developed during the crisis had become standard components of modern organized crime investigation methodologies that were being applied to address various forms of systematic criminal exploitation. The autumn of 1933 marked what survivors and treatment professionals recognized as the completion of the acute recovery phase for most individuals who had experienced systematic exploitation during the original crisis. This milestone represented successful resolution of immediate trauma, while acknowledging that some effects of the sophisticated manipulation techniques would remain permanent aspects of survivors' experiences. The achievement of completing acute recovery for the majority of survivors demonstrated that even the most systematic and sophisticated criminal exploitation could be successfully addressed through comprehensive treatment approaches that address both individual trauma and the broader social conditions that had enabled victimization. Treatment professionals continued to provide ongoing support for survivors, while also expanding their focus to address other forms of systematic trauma and manipulation that were being recognized in various contexts. The therapeutic innovations that had emerged from work with crisis survivors were being applied to help individuals who had experienced other forms of coercive control and systematic abuse. The winter of 1933 to 1934 passed as another successful season without significant criminal exploitation of artistic communities, confirming that the protective systems established following the crisis had achieved their objectives of preventing renewed, systematic victimization while preserving the openness and creativity that made cultural communities valuable. The success in maintaining protection for vulnerable populations while preserving cultural vitality represented a fundamental achievement in balancing individual safety with community openness. The approaches developed during the crisis had proven that societies could protect their most vulnerable members without sacrificing the values and institutions that made those societies worth protecting. As the 5th anniversary of the original crisis approached, communities throughout Europe reflected on the lessons learned and the progress achieved in protecting human dignity and individual autonomy from systematic criminal exploitation. The memory of those brutal winter months continued to serve as a reminder of both human vulnerability and the possibilities for effective response through coordinated action and unwavering commitment to protecting fundamental human values. The techniques and knowledge that had been developed through experience with systematic criminal exploitation had become permanent components of modern understanding of organized crime, psychological manipulation, and the protection of vulnerable populations. These insights continue to inform efforts to protect human rights and individual autonomy in societies that remained vigilant against threats to human dignity and freedom. The legacy of the winter crisis had been transformed from a story of systematic exploitation and human suffering into a demonstration of human resilience, international cooperation, and the potential for societies to learn from tragic experiences and develop more effective approaches to protecting their most vulnerable members, while preserving the values that made their communities worth defending and cherishing. And so we reached the end of our journey through those haunting winter streets, 1920s Paris, where the promise of artistic fulfillment collided with systematic exploitation in ways that would forever change how we understand human vulnerability and resilience. What began as individual stories of desperate young artists seeking warmth and companionship during brutal winter months revealed itself to be part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that challenged everything society thought it knew about organized crime and psychological manipulation. The heroin crisis that gripped Paris during those frozen months between 1922 and 1929 wasn't just another chapter in the city's bohemian history. It was a laboratory where criminal organizations perfected techniques for exploiting human nature that would influence criminal methodology for generations to come. But perhaps more importantly, it became a crucible where survivors, law enforcement agencies, and entire communities learned that even the most systematic exploitation of human vulnerability could be overcome through coordinated response, innovative treatment approaches, and unwavering commitment to protecting human dignity. The young people who experienced those brutal winters carried with them knowledge of both darkness and light that would shape their perspectives for the remainder of their lives. Their stories remind us that while human nature contains vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand them. It also possesses reserves of resilience and capacity for healing that can triumph over even the most sophisticated attempts at systematic control and manipulation. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that the memory of those frozen months serves not as a tale of despair, but as a permanent testament to the possibility of redemption and the power of human communities to protect their most vulnerable members while preserving the creativity and openness that makes civilization worth defending. The winter crisis had ended, but its lessons remain with us still, whispering through time about the eternal struggle between those who would exploit human weakness and those who choose to nurture human strength.